those timely remarks. Do we have any current legislators or prospective candidates in the audience with us? Raise your hand. What I would ask is, if we do, would you please stand, give us your name, office, and the district you are running in, please.
So my name is Frank Edelflue. I live in New Hampshire. I'm running for Hillsborough County District 38 as state representative.
District 31.
I'm State Representative Joe Petrie. I come from Farmington, New Hampshire. That's what I represent. I'm on the Education Committee, and you can't vote for me, but maybe. Thank you very much.
Anybody else? Current legislator and/or candidate for this election cycle? All right. Are there any school board members, administrators, or teachers in the audience? Would you please raise your hand? Okay, we've got a few of the choir, so that's good. Thank you very much. All right, we're going to move right on along. We're going to move into our first speaker, who is going to give us a history of Common Core state standards. Dr. Mercedes Schneider has been first and foremost a teacher for the past 23 years. She graduated from the University of Northern Colorado with a Ph.D. in applied statistics and research methods with counselor education concentration. Dr. Schneider has a newly released book on key individuals and organizations exploiting public education titled A Chronicle of Echoes, Who's Who in the Implosion of American Public Education. Please welcome Dr. Schneider.
Good morning, folks. I am not from Maine. I am not from New Hampshire. I was born in a town called Chalmette, Louisiana, 8 to 11 feet below sea level. Attended public school for all 13 years and attended 3 universities. I am currently teaching sophomore English in Louisiana. That was my first degree. It's in secondary English and German. I have a master's in guidance and counseling, and you already know a doctorate in statistics and research. I've taught from 7th grade through graduate school in 4 different states, regular education, alternative education. In 3 subjects, I've taught English, German, and statistics, so I'm varied. What I have for you today is a history of Common Core. It is somewhat based on a book that I just finished, my second book on Common Core, The History, Development, and Promotion of Common Core. I have some extra information in there for you, just to give you background, because I wanted to tailor this talk for you. I will not have time to get much into the development of Common Core, but I think history is important. You have these documents called the Common Core State Standards. They are extensive. They cover K through 12 education in 2 subject areas, and it's quite a bit of reading if you were to read through them. I have not read through them completely. I've read through a good bit of them, and I am teaching sophomore English, and I will tell you, I ignore them. And I am in a position where I can ignore them because I need to choose the students or the standards. And I've been teaching too long to try and force fit a document onto my students. And that's what I would have to do if I were required to adhere to Common Core strictly. My district, St. Tammany Parish Schools, is very active. The parents are very active, and they have really been kicking it up regarding Common Core because they are understanding now that it is not a good fit for their children. I'm very pleased to say that. I have a lot of facts that I'm going to give you, and I tried to create a timeline in my mind to where I could follow it linearly, and I'm just not able to do that. I'm going to do some jumping around, and so I asked one of my colleagues if she would view my talk and create a timeline that might go along with it so that you might have a visual aid, and she agreed to do that. So you will have a timeline. I will say also that what I am doing actually goes against the Common Core standards and ELA, English Language Arts, because I'm giving you a history of a document. And the Common Core follows a new criticism approach of documents, and that is the document needs to be viewed alone, absent any context or any reader background contributing to an understanding of the document. So it's treat the document in isolation. I don't live my life in isolation. I live my life as a knitted unit of my own history, of the history of people I am from, a history of a nation, of a world. And so when I approach documents, I approach them from a perspective of trying to understand them in a context. So I will present a history for you now. Common Core, in approaching this history, I thought, I'm seeing some threads here that have led to Common Core. I see a history of state standards and national standards. I see a history of assessment, state assessment and national assessment. I see a push for something called workforce readiness, and a push also for international or global competition. All of this comes out. Now, what also comes out is a general fear of the federal government taking over state education responsibility, so that comes out as well. And there's a blindsiding perspective that I think we're just becoming aware of, and that is the influence of philanthropy and business money upon public education in these United States. So many people have been concerned with the influence of the federal government that this idea of the philanthropic funded nonprofit encroaching upon education has caught people by surprise. And the business interest, now I use the term interest loosely, and I don't mean to imply that business being interested in the education of a nation is a bad issue. I don't think that. But it's much more subtle and deceptive and damaging in that it's more of an imposition of a business profit-driven mindset upon public education. There's been a very subtle takeover that is currently going on. And the Common Core is an example of that. Let me take you back to 1962. That's where I will begin. In 1962, President Kennedy appointed a man, Francis Keppel, as the director of the Office of Education. We didn't have a Secretary of Education, a Department of Education until 1979. So this man was appointed director of Office of Education, and he wasn't sure really what the job entailed. And so he went back to original documentation from the 1860s, and he learned that the Director of Education, one of the director's responsibilities, was to report on the progress of American students. And he was surprised that no one really had undertaken any formal reporting of what was going on around the nation. So that sets the stage for what would become national testing, the NAEP tests, National Assessment of Educational Progress. This idea would feed into the NAEP tests. 1964, President Johnson established the Civil Rights Act. 1965, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. The Civil Rights Act, there's a key component there regarding the recording and documenting of offering equal opportunity of education to subgroups in the United States. The ESEA of 1965, the centerpiece of that is Title I funding, which still is the centerpiece. The idea in 1965 was to help establish state departments of education and to combat the influences of poverty upon the classroom. The money from the federal government was given with the understanding that it would be loosely handled by the federal government, that state autonomy would be honored carefully. There was a provision in 1965 for waivers in case states felt like the federal government was encroaching too much upon state education, that the state could petition, for example, to use the money in what might seem like it was not an appropriate usage, but the state could say, yes, for our purposes, this is an appropriate usage of the money in making educational opportunity available to different groups in the population. ESEA was met with some resistance as a result of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. There was a call to document the subgroups in the United States, minority groups, whether or not they were getting appropriate education, and that produced in 1966 something called the Coleman Report. And I won't go through all of the Coleman Report except to tell you that it was a very piecemeal effort to locate assessments to assess how education was going in the United States. And there are some statistical issues with it, but what stood out to me in reading about the Coleman Report was that those writing it viewed assessments as necessarily culture-bound to the main culture, because that's the culture that all of these minority groups have to live up to in order to be successful in this nation. So that's the mindset. I'm not endorsing it, I'm just telling you. And there's another mindset there that the assessments would indicate if students would do well in higher level jobs, and if students did well on these assessments, that meant that they would do well in higher level jobs, and if the students didn't do well, that means that they were going to be relegated to menial, that's their word, menial jobs. So do well in the test, do well in life, don't do well in the test, don't do well in life, very black and white view. And so I noticed that right off, that there's a feeling that the tests are infallible. They are the indicators, and we need to follow them. That was not so much adhered to at the time, but it's present in our history. ESEA was reauthorized 6 times, in 1972, 1978, 1983, 1989, 1994, and then 2001, where it's been on life support since that time. I won't go through the history of ESEA except to point out that in 1983, a report came out that we are probably familiar with ad nauseum, A Nation at Risk. The result of a Reagan administration commission that was actually appointed under then Secretary of Education T.H. Bell. He just knew something was wrong with American education. He relied on SAT and ACT scores of college-bound individuals at the time, and you may be familiar with some of the wording. The document was written by a man named James Harvey. The tide of mediocrity that our nation is facing, and if another nation had imposed our education system on it, we would have considered it an act of war. Very strong words. I was a sophomore in high school at the time that this happened. I'm 47 now, and I think we're okay. I don't think that the United States is facing impending doom because of our education system. Let me add that I don't believe that that necessitates no improvements to education. That is not what I'm advocating. But what I am advocating is that we need to step away and really think if some group is coming and telling us that it's all going to fall apart and it's all due to our public education system, that there's much more to life in these United States than the education system. 1983, ESCA was reauthorized. Despite that, there were some suggestions that came out of that report in the Nation at Risk. A longer school day, 7-hour school day, which we already had a 7-hour school day when I was in high school. I know some states and some districts did not. The idea that a school year should be extended even to 220 days, more emphasis on math and science, more credits required to graduate, the measuring of teacher performance, but it wasn't, at that time, they weren't necessarily saying tied to test scores, but some measure of teacher performance. But an important point about A Nation at Risk was this was a suggestion. It was not a mandate. It was not assessment mandated and oppressive reform. But it is a document now that those who are supporting the mandated, oppressive, assessment-driven reform refer back to, which I think is comical at this point. Well, we were supposed to fall apart long ago, and it did not happen. 1994, now that's a time, the mid-90s, that's where my timeline is going to branch off some. A lot was happening in the mid-90s, beginning to mid-90s particularly. There was, in the 1994 reauthorization of ESCA, language that said we need to bring the different components of ESCA together, and we need a common core of state standards that will guide the curriculum, the assessment, the teacher development. So that is the usage of the words common core, but it's on a state level, and it was left up to the states how they were to determine that. In 1994, earlier that year, President Clinton introduced his Goals 2000, which did a couple things. One was it emphasized a need for the states to pay attention to standards, but Clinton also introduced the idea of national voluntary standards, and he was very careful with this idea of national standards because even in the 60s, the public was skittish of federal involvement in education. They were concerned about a federal takeover of education. And Clinton really wanted to tie assessment to this idea of national standards, but the Congress at the time was not willing. In 1994, Lynn Cheney was the chair of the National Endowment for the Humanities, and she actually contributed to an establishing of national history standards, and then she turned on the project. She said, you know, this is a federal takeover, and the Senate voted 99-1 to ditch the national history standards. So the idea of Clinton coming and saying, oh, national standards, he was very clear, voluntary standards. At the time also, we had people, prominent individuals. Diane Ravitch at that time was with the Brookings Institute, and she wrote a book in 1995, National Standards, and she subtitled it A Citizen's Guide. She was for national standards, voluntary standards, and promoted the idea, why do we have to have all these different standards for the states? If the standards are good, all states should have the same standards. There were other goings on in 1995. There was a National Governors Association annual meeting at which IBM CEO Louis Gerstner Jr. spoke, a very forceful personality, and he insisted, it's comical to read, we need national standards now, this year, right now. And very insistent about that. And, you know, we've got the governors just coming off of Lynn Cheney blasting the the history standards and the public being skittish of any kind of federal involvement in standards. And Gerstner was trying to get the states to come together, the governors to come together and to insist on these national standards. It didn't fly then at that time, but that's a strand that I will come back to later, and I will come back to the mid-90s later on, because there was a creation of an organization, a very influential organization to the Common Core as a result of Gerstner and his push. Moving on with the reauthorization of ESEA, in 2001 we had No Child Left Behind. We had George W. Bush coming in back to the mid-90s. There was a Texas miracle, I don't know if you knew about it, in standardized testing. Texas had figured it out, and they were testing, and they were holding the educators accountable, and the students were doing great on the test, and it was a miracle. Except that there were a couple reports that came out in 2000, one out of Boston College, one out from the RAND Corporation that said, you know what, you can make test scores go up if you weed out kids who aren't doing well and you don't test them. You frustrate them, they drop out later. These things need to be investigated. They were not investigated, and so George Bush came in. C student George Bush, by the way, he was not a remarkable student, but he had connections, and so he was demanding educational excellence, 100% proficiency in reading and math by the year 2014, nationwide. I wonder that no one called him on how impossible that goal would be, but they did not. By the mid-90s, they were willing to hear it. The Congress came together. Oh, the two parties came together. This is going to be great. It's monumental. We're going to do this. And the system was really punitive. It was George Bush's No Child Left Behind test-driven system. The only component that allowed states to survive it was that the states would still determine their own standards, determine their own assessments, except that by that time, the National Assessment of Education Progress was established. Educational progress, the NAEP test, was established. NAEP, here I'm taking another trail, NAEP was officially begun in 1964. The tests were finally brought together in the 1990s and piloted up until the year of 96, at which time they were officially ready to be given to states at the state's discretion. When George Bush introduced No Child Left Behind, then if a state had Title I funding, that state had to volunteer to take the NAEP test. You see, the original intent of Title I was that the federal government would not be overly involved, and by 2001, here it is. You want the federal money, you got to take the NAEP test. You need to set annual goals. You need to use your own standardized tests to prove that you're meeting those annual goals. And so what did states do? Well, they did what people will do in a high-stakes situation. They found a way to game the system. That's how it will be. If the pressure's on too tight, there will be a gaming of the system. And so the states simply aimed lower. They aimed for what they reasonably could get to where they would not be put into any kind of review, where their schools would be taken over, where their funding would be taken over. Part of No Child Left Behind said a certain percentage of your funding has to be given to students who want to escape your failing schools. If you have failing schools, you've got to send them away. Send your students away. Give them the right to choose other schools, and those schools can be charter schools. And so the districts were facing the issue of punishment and giving funding away if they were found deficient. And so they simply created a system where they did not set themselves up for that, for the most part. By 2007, No Child Left Behind was an admitted failure. It was supposed to be reauthorized in 2007. That didn't happen. Congress didn't want to touch it. We have elections coming up next year. You know, who wants to touch this right now? We're just going to let it be. Another event that happened in 2001 when No Child Left Behind was created. It was created in December 2001 and instituted in 2002. Was that Arnie Duncan, who is our current U.S. Secretary of Education, was appointed CEO of Chicago Public Schools. And he employed these two individuals, David Coleman and Jason Zimba, who had just piloted an organization called Grow Network. It was an assessment network. They were involved in assessments tied to No Child Left Behind, in teaching teachers how to use assessments and how to be data-driven. David Coleman and Jason Zimba are two of the inside individuals on the Common Core state standards. The very inside, the inside of the inside. They are well-positioned individuals, and they go back to Arnie Duncan in 2001. And they rode, their Grow Network rode that assessment wave that was brought about by No Child Left Behind. So you need to know that this goes back to them. 2007, No Child Left Behind is failing. It's put on life support. No one wants to touch it. By the time Arnie Duncan comes along, 2011, he's granting waivers from it. Waivers that have veered from the original intention of a waiver to give the states freedom. He's using them now to blackmail states. If states signed on to Common Core as part of their waiver for No Child Left Behind, if they signed on to assessments, and then the states really do decide to be state-led and they want out, well, Arnie Duncan has the right to yank the waiver, to make demands on the Title I funding. And so we are in a fix regarding Common Core, and states really deciding what they want to do regarding Common Core, because they have to face Duncan over this right now. Let me go back to the mid-90s. In the mid-90s, Louis Gerstner spoke to the National Governors Association. The national governors were not ready to try and take home the idea of a set of national standards, especially not now. Louis Gerstner said, we need a bone-jarring education revolution, okay? And the national governors are thinking, Lynn Cheney, Lynn Cheney, we're nervous about this national standards issue. But Gerstner was very influential. He was a businessman, a business CEO with a business mind, giving a speech to governors about the state of education in our nation. So by the end of that speech, he had determined, apparently, that he was going to offer the next educational summit. It was going to be in '96 at his IBM facility, and that's exactly what happened. That is like the major entrance of business into this Common Core situation. It goes back to then. I think in an effort to placate an influential man like Gerstner, that may not have been the only reason, but that was certainly an influence. The governors created a nonprofit that was supposed to serve as a standards clearinghouse. And the name of that nonprofit is Achieve. And Achieve is an inside group for Common Core. Now, the Achieve board was comprised of approximately half governors and half business CEOs. So there's your business interest, almost exclusively white male. To this day, the board of Achieve is that way. And they were supposed to offer standards, okay, a clearinghouse. We're going to let the states know what's out there, but very quickly, Achieve turned into an evaluator of standards. And Achieve, the folks working for Achieve, one of those people is Sue Pimentel, who is an insider with Common Core. She was a consultant with Achieve at the time. I don't know if she goes back to mid-90s, but she goes back to, I think, late 90s, early 2000s. I would have to look at the tax documents. She's inside, let's just put it that way, inside of the goings-on of Achieve. Achieve said that they would not be grading the standards, but they relied on groups that did grade the standards. The Thomas B. Fordham Institute had been grading standards since the late 90s. The American Federation of Teachers had been grading standards. So Achieve sent a double message. They said, we're not going to grade the standards, but we're going to rely on groups that did grade the standards. And then they instituted in 99, I believe it was, a pilot study on the state of standards, and they used Michigan and North Carolina standards, Achieve did. And they offered interesting advice to Michigan. Okay, the standards aren't up to par, but we don't want to upset the public and change the standards, so leave them the same. Let's add another level, a patchwork level between your standards and curriculum, so that it doesn't really look like you changed anything. And so there was that deception that came in. We don't need to tell the public really that the standards need changing. And I thought, wow, okay. And then you go back and you knock states for their standards, but you're telling them leave the standards the same because we don't want to disturb the public. That element came in. By 2001, so 2001 you have No Child Left Behind. 2001 you have David Coleman working with Chicago Public Schools on assessments. 2001 you also have the establishment of something called the American Diploma Project. And what that was, in short, it was like a Common Core for high school standards. We are going to create a Common Core of standards. Two influential groups there, Thomas B. Fordham Institute and Education Trust were involved. We're going to create high school standards. We're going to invite states to become involved in aligning to these standards, and that's what the American Diploma Project did. Now, Achieve and the American Diploma Project, the American Diploma Project is still a part of Achieve. By 2001, Achieve was also saying that there needed to be reworking of standards nationally. You have the American Diploma Project coming out with, in 2004, they're saying, they came out with this report, Ready or Not, creating high school standards that count. And they said, you know, our high school standards are terrible. Now, they had just celebrated the NAEP scores from 1996 to 2000. Look, the NAEP scores are doing well, but for some reason, by the time it got to high school, oh, the high school is doing terribly. The NAEP tests that they were referring to were given in 4th and 8th grade. So right there, it's like, well, how does that work? That, okay, the lower grades are doing well, but by high school it's terrible? Because you're focusing on high school, it's terrible? So they said, yes, the high school diploma is just a piece of paper. In fact, employers and universities don't pay any attention to it. And I was like, you know what, I graduated in 1985, and universities did pay attention to it, and employers still pay attention to it and use it as a point of reference for entry-level jobs, high school diploma or equivalent. So I wouldn't necessarily say that it's just a worthless piece of paper. But their goal was to promote national standards for high school at that time. By the time 2008 came around, the American Diploma Project, you've got Thomas Fordham, Education Trust are very much a part of this. They're starting to say words like a critical mass of states have discovered a common core of standards, K-12 standards. They discovered this. Oops, there they are. And, you know, we're still going to be voluntary, and states are still going to have say, but we've got this common core emerging. Now, I don't have enough time to get into it, but I will tell you, I do have a blog, and you can read about this information on my blog. If you Google my name, you will find my blog, Mercedes Schneider, you will find it. And I've written about the Common Core Memorandum of Understanding. That is a document that was drafted in 2009. Before there was a Common Core, it was the bandwagon document. State governors and state school chiefs signed the document and said, yeah, we're in for this Common Core. I can look at that memorandum of understanding and I can see how some of what came in this 2008 Achieve report has been modified and put into this memorandum. I'll give you an example. From the 2008 Achieve report, which is entitled Out of Many, One. It's out of many, comma, one. Okay, the coming together, so to speak, of the standards. Even though the report still focused on the progression of their American diploma project. They said, okay, the standards, states will still be able to modify and make them personal. And in the Memorandum of Understanding, there's definitely adherence to the Common Core, but if you want to add extra, you can and call it personalized for the state, but you can't take away. But you can add, and we'll call it personalized. So there's a playing with the language. Oh yes, it's personalized. Now voluntary is a word that is worthless to me, and you should really question it if you're hearing it now, because to volunteer for Common Core in 2009, it took 2 signatures. Oh look, the states have volunteered for Common Core. A governor and a state superintendent signing a document saying, yep, we're in. Teachers were not at the heart of this. There were so many games played with how teachers were brought on board, but let me not get ahead of myself. In 2007, and this is in my Common Core book, I found a document for the Council of Chief State School Officers annual meeting in November 2007. I found it as part of minutes for one of the states, that in that meeting, the state chiefs were told, you may as well agree to this national standards idea before the federal government makes you. So you may as well just come together and do it. So there's a coercive element there. It's like, just come together because the federal government's going to make us, so let's beat them to it. Gene Wilhoit was the president of CCSSO, that's the state superintendents at the time. By 2008, he and David Coleman, who was in with Grow Network, he sold Grow Network to McGraw-Hill in 2004, stayed on as CEO. In 2007, he establishes a new company, Student Achievement Partners. It's a company until 2011. It was registered as a nonprofit because they got $4 million from the GE Foundation that year. And now, if you go on Student Achievement Partners website, it's exclusively Common Core. This man is an edupreneur. He rides the wave, and this is it. So you go on and you find that that's what Student Achievement Partners is. David Coleman, 2008, summer of 2008, and Gene Wilhoit approached Bill Gates. And they asked Bill to fund the Common Core State Standards Initiative. They need to find big money that's not federal money. Even though by 2009, Arnie Duncan is telling the National Governors Association in 2009, we're going to do this Common Core, and I'm going to fund, the U.S. government's going to fund the assessment consortia that go along with Common Core. $350 million we're going to pay for assessments. So if anyone tells you that Common Core is separate from assessments, it never was. It never was intended to be separate from assessments. It was meant to drive curriculum. The American Diploma Project in the late 90s, in talking about their high school standards, they discussed standards as driving curriculum, driving the whole process. So that was intended, that the standards would drive, and indeed they do, drive the whole process. So if someone comes to you, like Sue Pimentel just said this recently in a Forbes interview, an interview for Forbes, that it's implementation that's the problem. It's not the standards. The standards are fine. Well, the standards are being advertised as ensuring, that's their word, ensuring what all students need to know and be able to do. It's like, well, how do you know? How do you know? Because you never bothered to test it. Well, it's based on research. Well, where is it? Where is the research? And all that they have is they have piecemeal research for different components. But I'm going to tell you as a researcher, if I create an entity, whether that's standards or a test, some measurement out of different parts, and the different parts have research, I need to research the creation from those parts. And they didn't do that. It's simply been declared as working, and they've dumped on it's the states are having trouble implementing. Well, here's a practical issue. If your standards are not really clearer as you're advocating they are, and they're causing implementation issues nationwide, they're just happening to cause implementation issues across the nation, then guess what? It's the standards. It is not just, oh, this state and that state. We have states all over the nation having issues with Common Core math. Parents in an uproar, Common Core math. Louisiana, my district, Common Core math. What is it with this math? Parents being called upon to go to special sessions to learn how to teach their kids math. Why is this happening in different states? Are all of these states moronic at the same time? Is that what's happening? Or is it the standards? You know, simplest solution is often the best one to pursue. And so Bill Gates agreed to fund it. Why? Because it sounded good, and Bill Gates likes to bring things to scale. He likes big education reform. If we can bring something national, then he really likes that idea. He asked Gene Wilhoit if it would work. Gene said there are no guarantees, but then that next year, National Governors Association and Chief State School Officers drafted this memorandum of understanding and wrote the governors in. And the state superintendents. This is what we're doing. It's groupthink. That's all that it is. It's the same reason teenagers smoke when they're in a group of people smoking. It's group pressure. Hey, everybody's doing it. Well, NGA at their conference, they thought that was really impressive to announce that 46 states and 3 territories had signed on to Common Core in 2009 before it existed. That really is dense. It's like, wait, you said we're going to do this? We agreed to be state-led. Really? It sounds like you just agreed to go along with something that you really had no idea was going to happen. David Coleman went public and said that he had been going around convincing governors to sign on. He actually said that in a speech, so it was a sales job. And so Bill Gates is funding it. Arne Duncan has no child left behind waivers to rely upon to keep states in. He doesn't want them to be state-led out of it. But what about Indiana? Well, Indiana is on a conditional for a year right now, where Arne has said, okay, we'll see how you do. But Indiana's standards are very close to Common Core. And so Arne Duncan, he's willing to pull that waiver. He pulled that waiver on Washington for not assessing their teachers, and he pulled that waiver on Oklahoma. Mary Fallon, the chair of NGA, had to sign. She was in a fix. The legislators said, we don't want these standards, and she let that bill sit. But she had to sign it. It's like, what are you going to do? Just say, I don't care what my state wants, I'm just going to do this. So it's very much coercive. I think I've given you a pretty good history of where the standards came from. Implementation is another story. So much. I have a piece I'd like to invite you to read on my blog, and it talks about some of the contradiction in the sales job. It's called the Fordham Strong Arm. If you just Google that, Fordham Strong Arm, you'll see that the Fordham Institute said, we're going to grade the state standards, and they graded the state standards, found some state standards superior to Common Core, and said Common Core is it. They said some state standards are better than Common Core, but we all need to do Common Core. Okay? Well, how do you make the determination of what is a good state standard? It's not the NAEP scores, because let me tell you, the NAEP scores were all over. Fordham Institute graded standards good, that the states had terrible NAEP scores. They graded standards poorly for states that had great NAEP scores. It was all over the map. And you know what? California, they said, California has great standards. Well, why are you asking them to change to Common Core if they're great? Never mind that. But their NAEP scores are terrible. What's the problem? Chester Finn? Oh, it's the implementation. Well, if it's the implementation for California state standards and you're saying better than Common Core, then why are you promoting Common Core there? And why are you not addressing this cop-out that you're giving of implementation? Thank you, folks. I think I've downloaded enough on you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mercedes.